So, why has trust in politicians declined so much?
I don't think it was ever very high to start with, but it has gone down. There's no doubt. I've seen evidence supporting that. But it's gone down from, I suspect, a fairly low level. But that's also true of other institutions. So it's not, I don't think it's necessarily linked to politics. Politics is an aspect of a broader trend of distrust of institutions. And so I think it should be posed as a broader question, what's going on there? For example, the media is less trusted than it used to be, considerably less trusted. Um, so what's going on there? Um, well, partly, I guess, has to do with the exposure that politicians have and other public figures. And it's not just politicians. Um, Machiavelli in the Renaissance used to advise politicians, princes, he called them, to lie routinely to their publics in order to manipulate them to promote the public good as he saw it. He thought that shouldn't just be an exception, it should be the rule. It should be a quite normal part of the toolkit of princes to lie. Well, that was easy for him to say in the Renaissance. It's a lot harder to lie and get away with it now because um, everything's scrutinized more closely. In the Renaissance, that wasn't the case. You could lie, and there was obviously a risk you'd be caught. And if you're caught, your reputation is damaged, your credibility is damaged. People won't trust you as much. That's always the risk with lying. And it's simply harder to lie and get away with it now. And so, what looks like an increase in lying and dishonesty may be simply that we see more of it. It may not be that it's actually increased. It's very hard to say. I mean, it's possible. I'm not ruling that out, that politicians are more dishonest now than they used to be. It would be very surprising if that were true. It would be very surprising if our politicians today in the Democratic West, let's say, were as corrupt and as dishonest as Renaissance politicians, the Borgias and Cesare Borgia and people like that. Um, but they may appear that way because we see more of their deceits. I mean, the number of times politicians have got caught out lying, and then they seem surprised, and then you're surprised. Why are they surprised? Because it just can't get away with it now. Um, Things like, for example, that John F. Kennedy got away with as president of the United States, his successors have not gotten away with because the press is less deferential. There's more scrutiny. There's more ways in which you can be found out. And so I think the decline in trust, relative decline in trust in politicians is partly, at least, a function of their greater exposure, greater transparency, um, and gives the impression that they're dishonest. Well, a lot of the time they are dishonest, but that undermines trust. Whereas in the past, particularly in the distant past, they simply got away with it more.
Sure.
And
Do
so
you,
that the effect of that is to erode trust. I'm not saying that's the only explanation or even the best explanation, but I think that has to be a part of it.
is information and, or sorry, is access to information and trust inversely proportional? The more information that we have, the less trust that we will have in modern institutions?
Not necessarily. Depends what the information is of. If if it's information about the misdeeds of a politician, his lying or his corruption, then yes, it's going to harm that person's credibility, the public's trust in him, in his word. Um, but there are other kinds of information that wouldn't necessarily undermine trust. What it does is it sets a higher standard for public figures to check their facts. They can't just say anything because it's so easy to check now. It wasn't so easy in the past. People can go straight onto the internet, they can look things up, etc. It wasn't so easy to do in the past. So we had to rely on the media, for example, to check these things for us, to hold politicians to account when they said X, Y, or Z. Um, that's still true to some degree, but it's easier for everyone to check. And that means that politicians have to be more careful what they say, which isn't a bad thing. The standard of information has gone up, and the expectations have gone up, and politicians have to be careful. Unfortunately, one consequence of that is that politicians are now very reluctant to say anything. They play word games, they mince words, they talk around questions, they change the question because they're afraid they're going to be caught out. And whereas in politicians in the past, when they weren't subject to the same scrutiny, um, they couldn't have been caught out quite so easily. They may have gotten away with it more.
But why are politicians so eager to misinform, even though everybody has access to information that would render their sayings moot or ineffective? Like, for example, as you were saying, if a politician lies, we can just go on the internet and fact check them. Has
Mhm.
no one told politicians and, like, people in modern institutions that the internet exists? Like, are they just comically unaware of this? Or are they just doing the doubling down on the lie and hoping that we'll forget or hoping that we'll just walk away from the conversation? Because it seems like, on the one hand, we all have access to the information, but on the other hand, they don't know that we all have access to the information.
Yeah, right. If I can't see you, you can't see me. And
Right.
so they think, oh, well, if they don't see me cheating, then I'm safe. But that's not the case. Well, but my impression of most politicians is they don't like to lie. And that's not necessarily for ethical reasons. I don't think many of them have that much difficulty lying ethically. Um, but it's risky. Lying is risky. If you make a bold-faced lie, you risk being caught out, and the risks now, as I was saying before, are much higher than they were in the past. And if you take that risk and you get caught, then you're in big trouble because it's hard to walk it back. It's recorded, for example. I mean, in the past, not everything was recorded the way it is now. Everything's recorded, it can be played back and go on YouTube. It's viral. You can't walk that back very easily. And as you said, there's more information available and more avenues of information. Um, my perception of politicians is that they try to avoid lying. But they do engage in deception, and that's not the same thing. You can tell the truth and deceive people by withholding the truth without actually lying. And politicians much prefer that because it gives them what's called plausible deniability. They will, rather than simply make an outright lie, a whopper of a lie, which will be exposed pretty quickly, um, they will simply uh, try and deceive by telling you the truth, but withhold crucial parts of the truth. That's much safer because then you're not lying, but you can deceive that way. And I think a lot of politicians do that. They use ambiguous language. Uh, they distract, they divert, they deflect. They do all these, have a repertoire of devices to use. So I think actual outright um, uh, shameless lying isn't that common, although it does happen. And when it does, well, it's hard to account for it because uh, as you say, it's so easy to get caught. So you do wonder, what are they thinking? Now, it may be that they've simply misjudged how vulnerable they are to exposure, to being caught. Clearly, that's the case in a lot of instances because it almost always seems to get out. But a lot of the time, they're very cautious about what they say and quite deliberately avoid lying, but actively engage in deception. And I think it's an important distinction between lying, which is telling something that's not true, you know to be not true, and deception, which is withholding the truth in the hope that you will deceive people. They'll draw the wrong inferences, and then you're safe. Well, you might be safer because you can then say, well, I didn't say such and such.
I, this is a very immature question, but I have to ask it because I've never understood the role of lying and deceit in politics. Like, if the politicians are there to make the country or the community as great as possible, what role do lying and deception play in that? Or am I just misunderstanding what the disease actually is?
No, it's a fundamental question. It goes right back to Plato. Plato's Republic raised this as a central political issue. You've gone straight to the heart of a big problem that thinkers have chewed on for 2,500 years. Um, is lying for the public good. So there are straightforward lies that politicians engage in to promote their own interests. Venal, I call them venal lies. They're trying to cover up something or steal money or something, and they lie about it, and they may or may not be caught. So that's not an interesting case because we'd all agree that's wrong. Um, but the problem, and so politicians who engage in those, I don't think that's one that generates a lot of debate because we would all quickly agree. He took a risk, he lied, he got caught, he has to pay the price. Um, might not get reelected, it might be arrested, whatever. The more interesting case is politicians who lie for the public good. And that's one that thinkers have dwelt on for centuries, for millennia. Plato talks about this, and so do a lot of other thinkers. Um, so another position might be, well, just you should never ever lie if you're in politics, because lying undermines public trust. As you said, as you started, you said, why do we not trust politicians so much? Well, it's partly because they get caught out lying, and that erodes their credibility. We don't trust them. But would we necessarily want a politician who never lied to us, ever? Um, so we don't want a politician who routinely lies to save his own skin, but do we want a politician who never ever lies, a kind of saintly politician? So I used to teach a class on this, and on political ethics, and I had very few students. I would always ask them this question. I had very few students who agreed that politicians should never ever lie, and it was easy to come up with examples where we would want politicians to lie, and this is the problem, I think, with an overly moralistic view of politics. It rules out a lot of things that we may want politicians to do. So I'll give you the obvious example. In a national emergency, it may be necessary for the state, for the government, for politicians to lie to the public to protect it. For example, if you're if you're a political leader and and there's a war, and you're asked at a press conference, are you planning to attack the enemy tomorrow? You wouldn't want to tell the truth about that because you'd then be giving away information to the enemy. So you might want to lie about that. Or if you're asked, for example, if you're a minister of economics, minister of finance, let's say, and you're asked, are you going to devalue the currency tomorrow? You might lie so that you avoid a run on the currency, which might tank the whole economy. So there are extreme situations where you would want politicians. I think most people, I mean, obviously not everyone, most people would want politicians to lie to them. They just
But
don't want, like Machiavelli says they should lie routinely. They should just keep as a normal part of politics. But I don't think people want that because there'd be no trust left. But I think we do want lying. So the question is, where would you draw the line? What are acceptable and unacceptable situations for lying or doing other things, killing maybe even?
yeah, I was just going to say, I disagree with these things in some ways, so I want to offer a little bit of pushback. It
Sure.
sounds like we're talking about if I ask someone, oh, are you going to shoot me tomorrow? And they lie and say no, or something like that, that automatically makes them a better person or somehow with higher ethics or morals. Because they didn't give me the information that was suitable to me in some way. It also, and this might be a little bit of a riff that I go on, but Shannon Curry and Lex Friedman did an interview and they were talking about infidelity. And Dr. Shannon Curry was basically talking about how her view on infidelity and disclosing that information to the partner is very different from most people because she would say she would not want to know. You know, she would want her partner who committed
Mhm.
the infidelity to never tell her and her partner deal with the stress and the pain and the trauma
Yeah.
if you know all of those circumstances are met because she would not want the PTSD and everything. She would want the lie, whereas her partner at the time, who didn't commit infidelity, but they were just comparing and contrasting, her partner would say, "No, I want all the information. You don't get to decide how I react to the information. I would rather be told everything, and then I decide how to move forward." That's how I think. I think the former example of the partner committing infidelity, but the partner who was cheated on not wanting to know, I think that's how governments and modern institutions treat us. Kind of like very childish, very like, oh, we'll give you everything that we think you need to know. Whereas I don't understand why they don't just tell us everything and then see how we react. Because I understand what you're saying in the sense of, are you going to attack this nation tomorrow? We want to lie to make sure we preserve public unity and
Mm.
public safety. I totally understand that. But at the same time, do you understand how public unity and public safety would be destroyed in that way? It seems like you're just assuming, not you, but it seems like they're just assuming all of these things. So how do we not compare and contrast, but how do we get more information from our politicians, but also respect that maybe they have lines that they don't want to cross in order to play their game?
I know what you mean. Not everyone wants to know the truth, and um, yeah, because it can be unpleasant. You may not feel like you can handle the truth, you can cope with it, etc. But you can't assume that's true of everyone, and it is very paternalistic to simply assume that well, people just can't take it. They're not robust enough emotionally, so we'll keep it from them. Parents do that to children, right? They tell them little myths and fables and about the tooth fairy and various things. Um, Santa Claus, whatever, to keep them happy. They know they're not true, but that's a relationship between a parent and a child. The relationship between a government and its people, at least in a democracy, is not meant to mirror, the relationship between a parent and a child. It's not meant to be paternalistic. A democracy, it means rule by the people, so it's not meant to be rule on behalf of the people by elites who are paternalistic. One way around this problem, I'm not sure if it's all that feasible, was proposed by an academic in the US, a woman named Cizella Bock, and she wrote a book on this subject. So she proposed that in democracies, um, uh, lying and this sort of thing may be permissible under certain circumstances, like the ones I mentioned, in exceptional circumstances, but that you should consult the public and ask them to consent. You get prior consent to not be told the truth. And I've never seen this in practice, how this would work in practice. Maybe it wouldn't work at all. But that's her way of squaring this circle is to say, well, for example, you might come to me, I might be a medical doctor, and you might come to me and I you have a problem and we do tests and I get the results of the tests. And you might say to me, just in like the example you mentioned, look, doctor, I'm emotionally fragile. I can't handle what if it's bad, if it's terrible news. So whatever happens, I want you to tell me it's good news. And whether it's not, it doesn't matter. Um, So in that case, you've consented to me deceiving you. So it may turn out that the news is bad, and I would then lie to you because you've asked me to, and you'll never know one way or the other, at least until it's too late. Of course, at some point you'll know. So she proposes something like this, that people could agree in advance, democratic citizens could agree in advance that there's certain areas and certain things where it is legitimate for states to either withhold the truth or even lie, actively lie. But it would have to be prior consent to it, and they would have to be exceptional circumstances, like a national crisis, a war, an economic depression or something like that. That's one possibility.
No, I like that. It just also makes us think about what they will define as exceptional circumstances. It
Yeah,
seems like
that's
every
right.
circumstance in politics feels exceptional. One thing
Yeah, who
about
decides?
trust,
Who decides? Yeah.
exactly. I would think the public would want to decide, and I think we're getting closer with the use of technology to actually create that antiquated town hall,
Mhm.
to or the public square, however you want to talk about that. What are your thoughts on social media and its impact in politics? Has politics fundamentally changed? The way politicians use Twitter, or maybe have started to use TikTok, the way that the percolation of ideas goes through social media and kind of is a game of broken telephone in a very real way. What are your thoughts on social media? Can social media have a positive impact in politics, or will it always be this noisy, negative monstrosity?
Well, I have to speak here not as any kind of expert because I'm not. So my opinions on this probably don't have a great deal of value, but I'll just give you my thoughts off the top of my head. I mean, I'm not that actively involved in social media. I'm on Twitter, unfortunately, and I have a somewhat dormant Facebook page, but I'm not on TikTok, for example. But I know what you're referring to. Um, it's hard to generalize. Like most things, it's not all one way or the other. It's a mixture. The question is it a mixture that's mostly good or mostly bad? That's hard to say. So one thing that's obvious is that it's led to a dispersal of um, of information. And so, for example, when I was young, when I was in my teens, um, uh, we watched television. My family would gather around the TV and we watch television. And if you wanted to watch a particular program, you had to be there at 8 o'clock on Tuesday, and it was come on, and that was it. If you missed it, you missed it. Or you gather around the news to watch the news together at 6 o'clock. Um, or you read one of 4 or 5 newspapers, let's say. So that's not the case anymore. I mean, it's before your time, I presume, so you wouldn't know it. But I mean, I have a very clear recollection of that. So I can see over the expanse of time how it's changed. Um, so I was on the train in August going from Montreal to Toronto, and I noticed no one was reading a newspaper. I mean, absolutely no one, not one person on the whole train was reading a newspaper. And same here. People just don't do that now. They are all on their phones. They're not even on computers now. They're on phones. And they're all reading different things from 1,000 different sources. So it's highly dispersed where we get our information from and highly selective. You just didn't have this degree of choice in the past. Um, and so we had to rely on a few outlets for information. And um, that's changed. So now people um, go and choose where to find their information, and that is good and bad in different ways, right? It's good in that they're not over reliant on one source, which is always risky, but it means they're very self-selective. Um, they go out looking for particular um, outlets for ideological reasons, let's say. And so you get this echo chamber effect. You get this polarization effect. So when the internet first arose, it first became popular. When I was 15, it didn't exist, not for ordinary people anyway. Just simply didn't exist. Now everyone's got it on their, attached to their hands virtually, and everywhere they go, they're looking at it. So they can fact check things and look up things, and they're doing it constantly, um, and spread things. Um, so they don't have to rely on mainstream media as much, which is one reason why mainstream media is declining. number of people who read newspapers, as I was saying, has collapsed. Old-fashioned newspapers. People watch a range of different news outlets, and the news outlets now cater more to particular demographics, particular political and ideological orientations. So there is this fragmentation. So the amount of information that's available has grown exponentially. I mean, easily available to everyone. But how do you navigate that? It's being lost in a jungle. And so people go for safe options, familiar options, options that confirm their biases, etc. So when it first came out, when it first became mass popular phenomenon, the internet, the expectation was it would be liberating because people could, find out for themselves and weren't overly reliant on a small number of sources. But that's not quite how it's worked, has it? It's caused this polarization, this fragmentation and dispersal, and that's put a lot of pressure on politics because politics is a realm of contestation and disagreement and conflict to some degree, but it's also a realm of agreement because to have a disagreement, you need to have a prior agreement. Otherwise, it's just warfare. Politics isn't warfare. It's resolving disagreements through other means. So there's got to be some prior agreement, but that's under great pressure when people are creating their own worlds, information worlds, and value worlds and identity worlds through the internet.
Does politics end when war begins?
Does politics end where war begins? Yes, I think so. It's a highly contentious point. A lot of people would say no, but I think it does. Yeah. But when you're engaged in war, politics has failed.
Why is that?
Well, as I said, politics, as I conceive of it, is um, is a way of making decisions in the face of disagreement through persuasion, through argument and debate, um, and through the ballot box, through if it's a democracy. And That's not happening in a war. A war is not an attempt to resolve anything except through force, pure force. Um, and to me, that just seems not part of the definition of politics. The ancient philosopher Aristotle influenced my view on this. So he said one of the things that defines human beings as distinct from other animals is speech. We have the power of speech, and so he said politics is discursive. It's where you engage in disputation and argument and debate. Um, Hopefully to resolve disagreements. But if it fails to resolve them, you may need to just rely on a vote.
Mm.
It may come down to a vote. You may not be able to resolve it through discussion. Um, but it stops short of physical violence. Then you're into something qualitatively different. There, you're not trying to persuade anyone of anything. It's not discursive. You're just trying to eliminate the opponent, subdue him forcibly.
So, what role does war play in politics? If politics doesn't work out, is war an inevitability? Or is war kind of like this last stand, this last bastion of if at the end of the day, we can always go to war?
It's not inevitable because two parties in a political system may reach a point of irreconcilable differences and also reach the point where they can't decide how, not just what, but how to disagree. So then it becomes pointless, right? You've reached the limit of what debate and argument can do. And you can't agree on how to resolve it. I mean, one wonders if the US is reaching this point now because neither side will accept the outcome of elections. So, They can't even agree who's won or lost. Um, so at that point, you have, I guess, at least two options. So one is war, which is what happened in the U.S. in the Civil War, or in this country, in Britain, where I am now, in the 17th century, you had a civil war, where yeah, you out come the guns, and you resolve it that way. But another option is to simply go your separate ways. Um, so you could have secession. You could have a state just breaks up. The parties agree to disagree. They just can't. They have irreconcilable disagreements. They can't even um, uh, agree on how they'll get through these problems. So they just have a vote and decide to leave. It happened in Czechoslovakia when they had a referendum and split into different states. Um, Britain has had one in Scotland. It chose not to separate, but Canada, of course, has had two so far. Um, and they came very, very close to just walking away, right? Forming separate countries, forming separate political systems, essentially. Um, in answer to your question, it's not inevitable that if politics fails, um, states will necessarily go to war. They may just walk away from each other, right? It happens when two people are fighting having an argument outside a pub. They don't necessarily resort to fists. They may just walk away, um, or change the political system fundamentally, just loosen the structure so they become more or less autonomous within a single, very broad, loose political structure. So they have as little to do with each other as possible. Um, that's sort of somewhere between the two.
I know I'm putting you on the spot with this question, but will it, is secession or civil war the end all be all for this? Like, are there no other ways to deal with polarization other than these extremes? I know polarization is a result of people going to the extremes and fighting on the cusp of the extremes, but it seems
Mhm.
like if you're in a marriage, if you resort to physical violence, it's obviously like you two are not great for each other. It's horrifying. If you two choose to break up, the divorce is messy and
Mhm.
complicated. And
Mhm.
so there
Mhm.
is an incentive for you both to try to figure out whatever problem lies between you two, to have
Mhm.
discourse, to have, to come to some sort of resolution. Even if you two can't move past those points, at least try to come to a compromise. What compromises exist in the world of politics today, especially in the Western world, where again we're talking about the polar opposites, and you're arguing on the basis of extreme right versus extreme left, and you have social media in your face every hour, every minute of every day, throwing more of those things to make you more polarized. How
Mhm.
do you even begin to have a conversation? How do you go to the couples therapist to come to a compromise?
Yeah, I mean, the analogy of a marriage is a good one. A lot of marriages are not good marriages, but persist. I know examples. They somehow persist because there are other considerations, um, and so they may not like each other, they may even hate each other, but they decide that on balance they're better off together than separately. Um, so you could keep trying to not resolve your differences because they may be systemically irresolvable, structurally irresolvable. But it doesn't follow that you necessarily give up, either by walking away and separating or by going to war. You may just endure it. I mean, to some degree, I mean, that's what Canada is, isn't it? Um, I mean, I spent the first half of my life there. Was born and raised there. So I know it quite well. Um, it's a pretty loveless marriage, and uh, I suspect that they may, the two parties involved in Confederation might not have gone through with it in retrospect if they had known, but they're kind of stuck with each other. So it may be a loveless marriage, but they kind of tolerate each other as two solitudes, to use that famous phrase. Um, but they haven't separated. They're still together, and they'll never be happy together. But as you say, the costs of separation should not be underestimated. It can be traumatic, and it can be lonely. You can end up suffering decline and pay huge costs financially, and so one has to consider all those things. That's not fixing the political system, but it's simply living with it for all its limitations, and just accepting that's the best you can do. But you're right, I think that the politics today in the democratic West, at least, these things are being exacerbated, I think, by social media. But the existence of disagreements, even conflicts, isn't necessarily a bad thing. As soon as families disagree, doesn't mean they break up. They People are imperfect, but doesn't mean you avoid them. You accept them uh, sometimes for their in spite of their limitations. So it doesn't follow automatically that because there's all this conflict and disagreement and discord, that it means the political system is irreparably broken. But there will be a point at which you might say that. And
Oh, that's
you might ask the question, are we getting close to that point?
no, that's great. That fills me with a lot of hope. I never thought of it that way. Having conflicts in marriage is like having a couple conflicts is not a deal breaker. That's just to be expected. And
Yeah.
so I think that especially now when we see so much political, I guess, disintegration, political fire, political hatred, political conflict, we automatically assume that this is the worst thing, and the entire democratic West is has sparks, and we're just looking for the gasoline type of thing. But if we think about it as this kind of natural occurrence, like of course we're going to have conflicts, but
Mm.
so do kids. The point is to show them how to resolve those conflicts. I think that that makes a lot of sense, and it reinvigorates people to look for resolutions, to look for places of agreement, rather than constantly just throwing their hands up in the air and saying, "Oh, how am I going to solve all of these conflicts by myself?" Um, yeah, no, thank you for that. That's
Well,
great.
let me just add one thing there.
Sure.
I'm not even saying that conflicts can be resolved, at least not in all cases, but they don't have to be. I mean, you just sometimes live with unresolved conflicts. Um, there, that's the nature of life. If you can't tolerate an unresolved conflict, you're in big trouble. A political system has to be resilient enough to be able to encompass conflicts that just aren't resolvable. What you need to do is have a way of coping with the existence of conflicts. But politics, as I said, is about conflict. It's a way of making decisions in conditions of disagreement, some of which are resolvable and some of which are not. Um, so we shouldn't set the standard too high for
Right.
politics. We should lower it a bit. And that goes to another point I want to make, if you'll allow me.
Absolutely.
What people often complain that politics, that principle plays such a weak part in political life, that power and interest dominate, and that questions of justice and right play a really subordinate part, maybe no part at all in some cases. And there's certainly some truth to that. There's plenty of evidence of that, certainly in history. But there's another risk on the other side, which is that our politics is too moralistic sometimes. There's evidence of that too, and I think the internet plays a part in that as well. Um, when you moralize politics and make it extremely judgmental, you reduce the chances of living with differences and tolerating differences. And I fear that this is a risk that we are also taking at the moment. People think politics now is just this pit where people fight for their interests. But a part of politics today is highly moralistic and moralizing. And that really makes it difficult for you to respect your opponent. And it causes people to be, I think, in some respects, less tolerant. Now, there are forms of intolerance that are good, intolerance of corruption, for example. We wouldn't want people to be too tolerant, but I have a feeling that some of the politics that we're engaging in at the moment that's accentuated or magnified by the internet is really moralizing, and that this is really quite damaging. And if we had a more realistic conception of politics, where we expected less from politics, where politics was broader and more encompassing than it is now, we might change our view of it. And if it was a little less moralistic, if people were a little less self-confident about their moral positions, which, I mean, I've spent my entire adult life studying moral and political philosophy, and the more I study it, the less confident I become. Um, a lot of this moral self-confidence is rooted in ignorance and simplicity, and it's also very dualistic. You know, when you moralize things, you turn them into black and white, and it's
Mm.
hard to agree with your opponent's position or even understand your opponent's position, let alone agree with it, if you see that person as Hitler.
Right.
And both sides accuse each other of being Hitler now, and I think this is a terrible degeneration. We should dial down the moral tone of politics a bit, and maybe you'll find that it becomes a little more tolerable and a little less apocalyptic.
Yeah, it's hilarious, and I say that loosely, when everybody compares everyone to Hitler. It's like
Yeah.
I don't really think you know exactly what you're comparing that person to. And if you did, I don't think you would choose Hitler as the example. I think, there are three people in the 20th century that you really don't want to, you know, assign comparison to. That's Mao, Stalin, and Hitler. So when
That's
people
why they
say
do it.
that, why do people say that? It seems like it's like an easy, like it's a low blow in a certain way. Like you, again, in the marriage, an insecurity of your partner, and so you immediately go to the worst thing you can say about them at the very beginning of the argument, rather than getting days in and you've had enough and you just say the worst thing.
Yeah.
That's how it feels, and I don't understand why people immediately say stuff that they have no clue about. I know you haven't read Mein Kampf. I know you haven't read Gulag Archipelago. I know you haven't read any of these books that detail the horrors, you know, of what these people did, and yet you immediately assign the comparison and say, "Oh, you're Hitler, you're a Nazi, you're this, you're that." What does that do? And then on the other hand, they retort saying, "Oh, we're never gonna solve political conflict because this person is Hitler, this person is Stalin." But
Hmm.
it's like oxymoronic. It doesn't make any sense.
I think I agree. It's terribly damaging, and it represents a real dumbing down. It's just, I mean, uh, there's a lot of disagreement about things now. There used to be a lot more consensus about um, uh, public life, about social life, and a lot of that has broken down. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but so a lot of disagreement about ethics and about culture and identity and things like that. But the one thing everyone can agree on, in spite of all of that, is Hitler was evil. Right? If we agree on nothing else, we can agree Hitler was evil. He's a symbol of evil. So if you're having a debate or an argument, I wouldn't call it necessarily a debate. If you're having a dispute with your political opponent, you reach for the low-hanging fruit. You reach for the convenient instrument to hit him with. The one thing we all agree is evil if we don't agree on anything else, Hitler. So you call him Hitler. Or maybe Stalin if it's on the other side. I mean, um, it's all too common as well to call people Marxists or communists. Uh, And as you say, the problem is the people who throw these labels out, accusations out, usually don't know what they're talking about. But neither do
Right.
the people, neither do the people who are the subjects of this. Um, so Donald Trump denied yesterday, denied he was Hitler or a fascist. He said, "I'm not a Nazi." Does he know what a Nazi is? Well, he doesn't know any more than the people who are calling him a Nazi.
Right.
He doesn't really know if he is a Nazi or not because he doesn't know. It's really represents, well, there's a phrase was coined, reductio ad Hitlerum,
Mm.
um, meaning, reduction of everything to mutual accusations of being Hitler. It represents a really um, crude reductionism in our politics. I would like to have a moratorium on any references to Hitler, Nazis, communists, Marxists,
Right.
anything like that. Just a moratorium, a cooling off period, and
Yeah.
then conduct debate without references to those. Because once you're accusing your opponent of being Hitler or a Marxist, um, there's no point in having a further discussion, right? It's over. That's
Yeah.
it. And who wants to, and it also raises the moral tone. I mean, what do you do in the face of Hitler? If you really believe that person's Hitler, do you walk away? Do you say, oh, well, we agree to disagree? No, you want to kill him, attack him.
Right.
So, and I don't think they really do. So, it brings us to the edge of the dissolution of politics because what's left to say at that point?
Yeah, it is. And this is, I completely agree with you. It is just interesting is the wrong word, but I'll use it anyway. Just interesting how you can call someone Hitler and then say that just loosely. Like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, and it makes you think if you
No
were
offense
there,
intended. Nothing personal. No offense intended.
right, right, no offense, but you're sounding like Hitler. First of all, are you saying that if I sounded like Hitler, you wouldn't do anything? Like you just casually say that in conversation? Because it makes me think if you were there in 1938, what would you have done? It's such a strange thing. But anyway, enough talk about Hitler because
Yeah.
we've mentioned him enough. So you see politics as balancing power and justice. Does that balance still exist today? And is justice getting lost in the pursuit of power?
Right. Well, politics is ideally a balance of justice and power because, as I said, there are two risks. Um, what you might call what I call in that book I wrote with James Murphy called How to Think Politically. We 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 criticize what we call um, naive idealism and naive realism. So naive realism is the belief that politics is nothing but power. This is just the realm of power. And naive idealism is the belief um, that really politics is about ideals, about justice. And both of these are wrong. Politics is about both. You can't avoid power. It's essential because you can't achieve anything without power. Power is risky because it can be used badly, but it's also essential. I mean, what can you achieve without power? Nothing. So you need power. Power is not a bad thing. The abuse of power is a bad thing, but you still need it. So there's no point in trying to reduce or eliminate power. The point is to accept that power is essential. You need power, but it's got to be combined with some conception of principle, of justice, of goodness. And so ideally, politics, as I conceive of it, is some combination of the two. And as I said, there are risks on both sides. So I did discuss earlier the risk on the side of excessive idealism, of excessive emphasis on justice and goodness and right. Makes your politics very moralistic and quite dysfunctional. In an extreme case, pathological. And the risk on the other side, which I think is behind your question you just posed, is what happens if there's too much emphasis on power? If you conceive of politics as just this war of all against all, um, and I see, yeah, I see both risks as significant. And um, I think it's a little too easy to just focus on the the loss of principle, the diminution or decline of principle, and say, oh, our politics is just all a giant swamp um, of power and interest. Um, so one has to combat both risks, and one has to be realistic about it. And so there's a certain form of politics that is abroad today that is excessively moralistic. And there's a certain form of politics abroad in the world today that's insufficiently moralistic, that's too obsessed with power. And so I'm looking for balance. I'm looking for a form of politics, ideally, that embraces both, encompasses both. And that would be, for me, the definition of a healthy polity. Um, and that's not what we have at the moment.
Can justice exist with incredible polarization?
Um, yes. Depends what you mean by credible polarization. I mean, if the polarization, if the disagreement is so great that they can't agree on what justice consists of, then how can you pursue it? The state can't really, it has to make choices. I mean, politics is about making decisions, and you can't just split the difference on everything, at least when it comes to principle. You might do it with respect to interests. You might say, well, look, your interests are colliding here, so I'll give you a little bit and I'll give him a little bit, and you'll just have to accept it. No, no, but you can't do that with principle, can you? You can't say, well, we'll kill a few people, but we won't kill too many because then we're going to split the difference and we'll oppress people up to a point. But no, you can't really do it that way with principle. So choice has to be made. At one point, at some point, the state just has to decide what's the right thing to do here, and and you have to know on what basis. And if the disagreement is so vast and so deep that the political community is fundamentally divided about what's the right thing to do, then how can the state act? If it does, it will alienate um, half the population.
It,
So, do you really want that? It's
it,
going to have to make a decision, and if it doesn't do anything, it's kind of making a decision as well. It's
mm.
deciding not to act. But my point is that there has to be some broad agreement, not total consensus, on what the right thing to do is. If you can't agree even on that, yeah, I think you're reaching the outer limits of what you can expect a polity to do, a state to do.
You mentioned a declining tolerance in politics. Do you think we're regressing to pre-Enlightenment rigidity?
I think I've written a book on the subject of the counter-enlightenment, actually. It's called Counter-Enlightenment, so I'm familiar with this, perhaps too familiar with this terrain. But I guess all I would say is we're not today, from the perspective of the 21st century, from 2024, we're not as, how should I put it, naively um, enamored of Enlightenment beliefs as we were in the 18th century. Um, and I think with good reason. So I'm not embracing or endorsing the opposite, counter Enlightenment views. But I think given that my if I may say so, considerable knowledge of the Enlightenment, there is something naive about it, about the Enlightenment, and um, it was not entirely in accord with reality, you might say. Um, it's a nice idea. Um, it's a beautiful idea slain by the ugly facts of reality in many ways. So I think the question for me is how far from Enlightenment ideals of reason and justice and peace and tolerance, how far from that have we retreated, and how far from that ought we to retreat to bring our politics into alignment with certain realities, realities of human nature, realities of human societies, which the Enlightenment um, really, I think, didn't fully embrace. And so it's that's a very tricky one, a very complicated question. In other words, I don't think that abandoning aspects of the Enlightenment worldview is necessarily a bad thing, but abandoning all of them is a disaster. So, so we need to determine what's worth saving and what isn't, and decide on that basis where we stand with respect to the Enlightenment project, for want of a better term. Scholars don't tend to use the word Enlightenment project anymore, but for want of a better term, if we want to preserve the Enlightenment project, we need to um, decide what we're talking about and what's worth preserving. I myself am more skeptical than a typical Enlightenment philosopher.
Would the Enlightenment project be a gradual thing or more of like a road to Damascus experience?
Well, it would be a utopia. I mean, it's if it depends. I mean, there wasn't a single Enlightenment project. That's the problem. There were
Mm.
a range of them, so it's hard to talk in general terms. Um, uh, but generally speaking, if I may, the it's not realizable. It's simply it's utopia. It's an unrealizable ideal. Um, so, but that doesn't mean it's totally to be rejected. So you have to pick and choose. You have to cherry pick. It's like everything. You have to cherry pick the good bits and leave the bad bits. So I consider that Western civilization, if I can use that phrase, since the Enlightenment, to be an adjustment, albeit a terrible one, um, to of that idea of those ideals to reality. And when ideals confront reality, they have to adapt. If they don't, you're just an ideologist. Ideologists adjust reality to their ideology. Realists adjust their ideology to reality. So the Enlightenment was an ideology, but it wasn't a wholly wrong one. But there were aspects of it that weren't realistic, and we need to adjust it in appropriately. That's a bit vague. I'm sorry, that's a bit vague, but it's a hard one.
No, absolutely, and you don't have to apologize. Everything right now is very difficult to talk about, and all
It
of these
is.
ideas are
Yeah.
incredibly complex. And you can't. One of the problems with talking about these things, especially now with the generation that has the attention span of a tweet, or the younger one that has even less, is that you can't cram these complex, deep philosophical understandings into a soundbite. You just can't do it.
Yeah.
But if you don't try and at least talk about these things in vague or superficial terms, you can never get those people onboarded. And so there is this like weird balancing act that I'm struggling with, and I know a lot of people are struggling with like how do you get people who don't have any deep philosophical critical thinking skills to understand deep philosophical critical thinking? It doesn't like it seems like A and not A. So I'm just saying that to say that, but it does like I'm very, very not skeptical, but very cynical about that. But I'm trying not to be. Speaking of cynicism, this is the last question because I know we are running out of time. But how can Gen Z elevate political discourse in a world filled with cynicism? It seems like since they were 10, they were in this like weird information bubble where the entire social media feed was constructed and tailored around their interests, around their political philosophies and political understandings, political leanings. And now they're being bombarded and coming into a world that is incredibly toxic to them, a world that
Mhm.
doesn't really care about them, a world that doesn't work for them in a literal and metaphorical way. But how can they step into office or use their platforms, use their technologies that they've grown up with to change the political landscape or improve it?
Well, here there is some small grounds for optimism because of the work that's been done recently by Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. You may have heard him. He recently wrote a best-selling book. He's written a lot of books, but this one really has taken off. And yeah, it's about he's an empirical social scientist, and he's done a lot of research on gathered together a lot of research as well on the impact of social media and on young people, and particularly that generation you mentioned, and the negative effects it's had on them developmentally. And this has really struck a nerve. I did see him interviewed on this, and he said that other books he's written hadn't had the same effect, but this one, he said, was a book where everyone is in agreement. And his bottom line is we should be restricting access of young people who are in this crucial formative stage of their development, sort of late tens, early teens. We should restrict their access to social media in particular, not necessarily to the internet, he says, but to social media in particular. And this has caught on. I mean, there are places all over now, jurisdictions all over the place that are banning phones, mobile phones, cell phones in schools, including in this country. It's caught on. It's happening a lot in the US as well, because he makes such a good case. And so I think that's small grounds for optimism. That would be one thing that I think would have good effects, is perhaps reduce exposure to social media in particular, to young people in that crucial period, developmental period. Um, and that might mitigate some of the harmful effects. Another is to struggle, oh, maybe it's in vain, but at least to keep struggling to um, increase the quality, the standard of what's available through the internet. And if I may commend you personally, so your podcast is to be commended for going into depth, allowing the time, we've had an hour together, to go into depth on these questions. That's exactly the opposite. It's to a tweet. You know, tweets reduce things, compress things, and in the process, they destroy all nuance, all ambiguity, all uh, uh, complexity. It goes out the window. So trying to do the opposite, make the best of the internet, make available to people um, in-depth discussions, interesting content, substantial content, and as much of that as possible, and then hope that people will access it. They'll get bored with tweets and endless, pointless accusations and arguments and debates back and forth, and will want to listen and will engage and go deeper. I mean, at some point, you would think, one would hope, that people would just find this so pointlessly boring, these tweets back and forth. I do. Uh, and interminable. They just don't end. They can't end because they're not seeking resolution. They're seeking to score points, to crush their opponents, to embarrass or humiliate them, or to win. So I think more podcasts like yours that take subjects and go into them in depth, spend an hour, and the more of that's available, the more people will access it, and more of that, the better. Beyond that, I can't really think of much. But
Well,
maybe that's a good point in which to wrap things up.
absolutely. No, Dr. Garrard, this was a fantastic conversation. I do want to extend and commend you back for actually wanting to talk about these things and wanting to go to the uncomfortable places. Um, for some reason, that is being lost now. Like people really don't want to, for fear of cancellation, and I understand that, but you're not doing it in a loose or inappropriate or unprofessional manner. You're doing it with real rigor and understanding and openness and transparency. And we need way more folks like you who want to talk about these core issues that affect us all, but in professional ways, not name calling people, not just calling everybody Hitler, for example. That's the last time we'll talk about him. Um, yeah, no, just thank you so much for this conversation. Where can we find you online? Where can we buy your books?
Well, you can buy them on Amazon. Probably the easiest thing to do. They're all there in paperback, so they're not too expensive.
What are they
Uh,
called?
well, the most recent one was called The Return of the State. It was published in 2022. And then prior to that was one called How to Think Politically. And that one is aimed at really non-specialist general readers, what I call serious general readers, non-experts, people who've not necessarily got any background in politics or anything like that. It's aimed at them. So probably that's the best thing to read, and maybe go from there. Um,
Great.
and
Well,
hopefully that would encourage them to read further.
yeah, absolutely. The best thing about the internet is that there are many avenues for many
Yeah.
different kinds of learners, different kinds of folks who want to understand. So that's one thing that's working
Let me
for us
end
all.
on one last point, just on that subject.
Sure.
We've been quite critical of the internet and of social media. There's a great deal that's wonderful about that, and I love it. Um, but the question is how to find it. It's like finding a diamond or diamonds in a great swamp of detritus, and you've got to dig through a lot. But it's a lot of great stuff there, stuff that was never available, so, at least so easily in the past. I make great use of it, and so it's not all bad in that respect, not at all. But so much of it is, and you have to try and avoid distracting yourself and try and find those gems. They are there.
They are there. You just have to use your deep philosophical critical thinking skills to find it. Dr. Garrard, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Nice to talk to you.